Well, welcome everybody. I'm Adam Goodhart from the Star Center, and thanks for coming out on this dreary evening, which is about to be enlivened and enlightened, illuminated by Peter Manseau. Although, Peter, I have to say that you're somebody who has a line into like more major and minor world religions than I can count, but you don't seem to have the ear of the rain gods. So what's with that? Do we have time to like sacrifice a sheep or something before you start to talk? Anyway, we are delighted, we are thrilled and proud to have Peter Manseau here with us tonight. Thrilled because he has written a terrific new book that you're going to hear about that's getting rave reviews and shout outs all over the place. You might have seen Peter in the New York Times, in the Boston Globe, in the Wall Street Journal, in Slate.com, all just within the past few weeks. It's really incredible, the buzz the book is getting. So that's why we're thrilled, but we are also proud because in a very small way, I think Washington College can take some credit for his achievement, or at least I will take credit on Washington College's behalf for Peter's achievement and dare him to contradict me when he comes up here in a moment. We're going to take credit, Peter, whether you want us to or not. And that's because Peter was our Patrick Henry Visiting Fellow in 2011 and 2012, and actually wrote part of his book here in residence in Chestertown at the Star Center, working in the Custom House and living in our fellowship residence downtown on Queen Street. And he also stayed with us part-time during the following year as a resident scholar. He taught courses in the departments of philosophy, political science, and English, and he also co-directed the Star Center's historically corrected collaboration with the New York Times. And in fact, if you look in the book's acknowledgments, which I hope you will, and I hope you look beyond the acknowledgments, you'll see that there's a lovely and generous shout out to Washington College and Chestertown, for which we thank Peter. The Patrick Henry Fellowship was created by the Star Center with the help of a major NEH grant and generous support from private donors and friends to foster creative, interdisciplinary, literary approaches to American history, to connect the past and the present, to discourage ringtones in public places. And, no, that's okay. At least if it's a ringtone at a Star Center event, it should be something historic like the Liberty Bell, you know, dong, dong, dong. I don't even know whose ringtone it was. I'm not sure if I'm looking. Ma'am, if it wasn't yours, then I'm sorry for looking at you. And it's also meant to encourage scholarship that reaches out beyond the academy to a broad general audience. And Peter has in every respect achieved all of that to the fullest with his book, One Nation Under Gods, which evokes an array of prophets, dissenters, heretics, persecuted minorities, embattled sects, whose intertwined stories combine to create a new history of America itself. In a coveted starred review in Publishers Weekly, the magazine hailed the subversive and much-needed revisionism of Manseau's tour de force, and they praised Peter for writing, quote, with a historian's eye for detail and a novelist's sense of character and timing. This is praise that they don't lavish lightly over there. Peter's whole career has been about breaking down barriers between topics, genres, and audiences. I won't give a long introduction of his richly layered past, but he's been not just a historian, but a literary scholar, a novelist, a memoirist, a journalist, a travel writer, now also a museum curator, since he's currently working on a major Smithsonian exhibition at the National Museum of American History on American religion. And he is also, as some of you may know, probably it's safe to say the world's only son of a priest and a nun, who then became a scholar of Yiddish literature. But that, as they say, is a whole nother story. Or I'm sure there's a Yiddish expression for that. Ahoy gabenka, something like that. Anyway, before welcoming Peter, I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, the Department of Philosophy and Religion and the Institute for Religion, Politics, and Culture. Thank you for joining us in creating this event. And I'd also like to invite you to come up afterwards, where Peter will be signing books over there where Aaron is patiently waiting by the credit card machine. If you're a Washington College student, you have got particular reason to scurry over to Aaron because this semester we are doing something very special. We are giving Washington College students a 50% discount on all books at Star Center events. So for just a ridiculously low price, a signed hardcover of Peter's beautiful book can be yours if you are a Washington College student. If you are not, and I'm looking at you, Jay Griswold, do not pretend to be, oh, okay. Full price, okay, there we go, all right. Well, with that, let's join in welcoming back to Chestertown the wonderful Peter Manseau.
Wow, thank you for that introduction, Adam. I'm really touched, and I'm honored to be back here. It's funny when one hears one's work laid out that way in a list, it starts to feel like I couldn't keep a steady job. It's true, I have a lot of interests, and I try to follow them, and all of those interests led me here to what was for me a perfect fellowship at the perfect time, the Patrick Henry Writing Fellowship at the Star Center. So I'm tremendously grateful to Washington College, to the Star Center, and to Adam, especially for making a home for me here. I was saying to my wife as we drove in through the mist, we drove in from Annapolis, and I was just realizing as we drove in that really this book, which is now out in the world, it just would not exist without the intervention of Washington College coming along just when it did. And this is true for a number of reasons. First of all, it gave me time and time to write, time to think, and tremendous resources, a wonderful old house in which to live while I was researching and writing, but also being here and encountering, quite by surprise, the resources of the college really shaped the way in which I approached history. My previous books had not been, strictly speaking, works of history. They were informed by history, but settling down to write a work of original history, I was sort of learning it as I went. And one of the most important things I discovered when I got here was this tremendous resource the college has, which is the America's Historical Newspapers Database, which I made use of every single day that I was a Patrick Henry Fellow. And I would pass hours just doing keyword searches on Hindu to see how in the American press the word Hindu had changed over the course of the 18th century into the 19th century, reading dozens and then hundreds of articles, charting the ways in which different religious terms changed over time. And so I was really reminded while I was working of that saying, how does it go? Newspapers are the rough drafts of history. Is that how it goes? There's journalism is the rough draft of history. For me, it was the rough draft, it was the second draft, it was the final draft, and now much of the journalism I was reading for my original research has ended up in the book. And this has suited me because I am both a journalist and a historian now. And if there's one thing that both journalists and historians have in common, they have many ways in which they don't agree. But the one thing that they both love, I've discovered, is anniversaries. Anniversaries seem to be the only occasions when we can convince large numbers of people that the arcane things we spend our time researching might be of interest to people who don't spend their days in dusty archives or searching keywords on digital databases. And so in that spirit, I wanted to start today by telling you about something that happened 200 years ago right about now, late in the winter of 1815. To me, it's an iconic moment in American history that isn't recognized as such, perhaps because it's not as dramatic as the shot heard around the world at Concord or the rocket's red glare over Fort McHenry. But this moment I'm about to describe to you is, I think, an alternate way about thinking of our national origins, and I hope that it will open up some of the themes that I address in the book. Well, it was over the course of March and into April in 1815 that 10 wagons left a hilltop in Virginia and slowly made their way north, hauling freight to the nation's capital. They weren't carrying tobacco or cotton or barrels of whiskey. They were carrying books. 6,487 books. These were the books that Thomas Jefferson had recently sold to the federal government as the founding collection of their new Library of Congress. Congress had a reference collection before this. It was about half the size. But during the waning days of the War of 1812, these 3,000 books went up in smoke when the British burned Washington. Jefferson had been retired for about 5 years by then, and so he didn't get a briefing on the fact that the Capitol, the White House, and the Treasury had all been destroyed by the British. He read about it in the newspaper. And because he was a lover of learning, apparently one of the first things he thought when he heard about all those books that were destroyed was what a great loss that was, that loss of learning in the nation's capital. All that paper that literally fueled the fire that burned down the heart of the nation. So he did what he was known to do. He wrote a letter. He wrote a letter at the time to a friend on the Congressional Library Committee, and he basically said, "So, I hear you might need some books." What he actually wrote was, "I learned from the newspapers of the vandalism of our enemy, that it has triumphed at Washington over science as well as the arts by the destruction of the public library with a noble edifice in which it was deposited. I presume it will be among the early objects of Congress to recommence their collection. This will be difficult," he noted, "while the war continues, and intercourse with Europe is attended with so much risk." Jefferson was basically beating around the bush here. He was clearing his throat before making Congress an offer he thought they couldn't refuse. As he explained then, like a true salesman, the books he had at Monticello were the best in the land, because only he, over the course of his life, had had the resources and the time to do the kind of travel and research that was then necessary to acquire a significant library. He proudly noted that when he had been the minister to France, he had spent most of his time in bookshops. This is what he wrote in his letter to Congress. "While residing in Paris, I devoted every afternoon examining all the principal bookstores, turning over every book with my own hand." He was apparently not concerned that anyone would say, "Well, weren't you doing your job at the time?" He just laid it all out there. He said, "I had the money, I had the time, I was in the right places to find the books that our nation needs now." And it was this letter that started those wagons on their way from Monticello to Washington 200 years ago, right now. But their journey from Jefferson's hilltop to Capitol Hill was far from simple. In between Jefferson's letter, written in the fall, and the loading of those wagons in the winter, those books, those nearly 7,000 books, became the focus of a remarkable debate. It raged in the press and in Congress for months. Its subject was the possibly atheistical character of the books themselves and the man who had acquired them. It was said by his critics that the books were full of, quote, "infidel ideas that might infect the nation if allowed into the halls of government." Critics worried variously that there were too many foreign languages among the books that Jefferson owned, and that the collection contained, quote, "English works on progress and speculative freedom." Freedom. With the smoke of British arson still lingering over Washington, some members of Congress even floated the idea of burning Jefferson's books to avoid any potential spiritual contamination. This campaign was led by the Federalist representative from my home state of Massachusetts. He was a fellow named Cyrus King, and he argued that the character of the man that had assembled the library and the place where he had acquired much of it, France, that this was evidence enough that the collection contained many books, he said, of irreligious and immoral tendency. Other congressmen found King's talk of book burning too much to take. Representative James Fisk of Vermont, who was a Democratic Republican like Jefferson, he reminded his colleagues that King had come from a state once known for hanging witches, and he wondered whether that practice might soon be introduced. Maryland's own Representative Robert Wright accused King of wanting to start an inquisition. To this charge, King replied that he had no such intention, at least not while his party was in the minority. In the end, party politics ruled the day. By a slim margin, the Democratic Republicans, with their majority in Congress, they approved the purchase. So those 10 wagons full of books, they had a bumpy journey. And to me, that makes the image all the more significant. Challenging ideas, overcoming obstacles, to move from the hinterlands to the capital, from the edges to the center. Isn't that the theme of so much of American history? We take for granted that this process occurs in the arts, in music, or in literature. Think of the ways that the songs of the enslaved moved from blues to jazz to rock and roll, which begins as subversive and eventually ages into the kind of respectability that brings the Rolling Stones into football arenas. Because much of my work involves Yiddish literature, I also like the example of a few vaudevillians in the Catskills, developing a style of comedy that filters down to Woody Allen, to Jerry Seinfeld, and eventually becomes mainstream American comedy that would be recognized even by people who think a borscht belt is something you wear. The case I make throughout the 500-year history told in One Nation Under God's is that this same process is no less true for belief. Perhaps because the image of a looming and respectable church on an iconic village green so dominates our visions of early America. This usually uncontroversial idea of the influence of the margins on the mainstream is often left out of discussions of the role of religion in our history. These discussions are more often dominated by arguments for and against the notion that the United States was founded as a Christian nation. When I began this book 5 years ago, we seem to have reached the peak of this controversy. There are a number of very good books laying out the case that, in fact, no, it was not founded as an explicitly Christian nation, and that should have put the matter to rest. But just look at what has happened in the last few days. If you've been following the news, you might have seen Christian protesters on the steps of the Oklahoma State Capitol shouting, "Go home," at Muslims who were born in America. You might have seen or heard news of the Idaho State House, where state senators refused to sit and listen to a Hindu invocation because the one senator leading this charge said they worship cows, which is not true, and had he sat and listened, he might have learned something. We've also seen new poll numbers, this was just released last week, that suggested that a majority of Republicans, 57%, support establishing Christianity as a national religion. While this is troubling as proof that many in this country don't really understand the First Amendment, it's even more so because the argument that America is a Christian nation has served as cover for a variety of racist and nativist sentiments for generations. Christian nation rhetoric can be found in the writings of those who fanned the flames of a mob's destruction of a convent in Charleston, Massachusetts in 1834. Those writings warned that Catholics were a threat to our free institutions, and they were directed by foreign influences. Just as it can be seen decades later in newspaper reports warning that non-Christian immigrants from Asia would cause the West Coast to be, quote, swamped, inundated, despiritualized, and un-Americanized. Even as a matter of demographics, Christian nation, the idea of it raises questions. To begin with, a large number of the people we now necessarily acknowledge as Americans, they just simply go uncounted in our memory of American history. To begin with, more than 100,000 Native Americans, who were mostly unconverted before the Trail of Tears, were pushed beyond the borders of the United States with the Indian Removal Act of 1830. That same year, the enslaved population numbered in the millions. In much of the South, they made up half the population. Given that only a vanishingly small percentage of the enslaved were Christians when they arrived, early America likely included more individuals with a connection to Native American or African beliefs than Catholics or many members of Protestant denominations. What do these non-Christians do to the idea that America was founded as a Christian nation? Introducing such uncounted people and their beliefs into the narrative of American history raises for some the same concerns that Jefferson's eclectic library raised for the Christian congressmen who opposed it. As that convoy of wagons bringing Jefferson's infidel notions north. As it rolled on, some in Washington surely worried what would become of the beliefs they held dear. Would books representing the dominant faith somehow be diminished by sharing shelf space with heretical ideas? Answers to that question can actually be found in Jefferson's library, not so much in the books themselves, but in what they represent. Of the thousands of books Jefferson sold to Congress, only a few dozen were concerned with religion. And contrary to the concerns of his critics, for the most part, they were far from strictly atheist. Jefferson owned texts related to a number of religious traditions, including a score of Bibles, a Quran, a history of heathen gods, and as many works by Christian philosophers as by deists. Religion for him was both an intellectual and an ethical pursuit, guided by curiosity and reason. But the truly fascinating thing about Jefferson's books is that while in Washington, his taste seemed eclectic to the point of being threatening, in fact, they barely scratched the surface of the actual religious diversity that existed beyond the Capitol at that time. Over the same country through which Jefferson's books traveled, there was living religious diversity about which he was likely totally unaware. While Jefferson owned a Quran and read it to make himself aware of its influence on the world's legal systems, at this same time, about 200 miles to the south, we now know of another man who didn't own a Quran, but who had it committed to memory. As Jefferson's library rolled north, Omar ibn Said was a 45-year-old resident of Fayetteville, North Carolina. He had been in this country just 8 years, all of them under the yoke of a master he called a kafir, an infidel, who he thought was a cruel man who mistreated him. After he was recaptured following an escape in 1810, Omar ibn Said was locked inside the Cumberland County Jail, Fayetteville. By this point, most of the enslaved in the country had been born here. In fact, it was no longer legal by then to directly import human beings from Africa. And so for the residents of Fayetteville, it was becoming more and more rare to see or meet a man who had brought with him the traditions of his homeland. Well, while locked in his jail, Omar ibn Said, according to news reports that soon began to emerge, he began to draw a crowd. First for his quietly mysterious demeanor, then for the strange way in which he prayed 5 times a day, and finally for the graffiti he began to put on his jail cell walls. Apparently, Omar ibn Said, locked by himself in the jail, had been given a small fire with which to keep warm, and he found among the remains of the fire small bits of coal, large enough to hold like a pen, and he began to write on his jail cell walls. He filled it with the curls and lines of Arabic script, which was most likely verses from the Quran. As his story became known, really around the country through the decades, news reports spread farther and farther, it emerged that he once had been a religious teacher and a leader in his community in the country that is now Senegal. He had been 37 years old when he was captured. In an Arabic account of his life he later wrote, he explained that in freedom he had loved to read the Quran, but in slavery he had been converted to Christianity. His only access to the faith in which he lived for decades was now his memory. In this he was not alone. An estimated 20% of the enslaved men and women brought to the Americas were Muslims. The others were members of a variety of African traditions. Across the South, plantation owners made it a point to add Muslims specifically to their labor force, relying on their experience with the cultivation of indigo and rice. Muslim names and religious titles appear in slave inventories and death records. This was particularly true in Louisiana, and you might have heard recently the governor of Louisiana, Bobby Jindal, compared the immigration of Muslims to this country as an invasion. Well, in fact, I have news for him. There were Muslims in Louisiana before the Louisiana Purchase, and the best known was actually one of the more famous African Americans in the country during his life. This is a fellow named Abdul Rahman Ibrahim ibn Suri. And he was a prince in his homeland who was recognized by a doctor who had traveled widely in Africa and happened to run into him. And when it became known that this Moorish prince was in captivity, his cause became a cause célèbre. He was in newspapers all around the country and even taken on a mini tour of the States. As one newspaper account noted of the Moorish prince, he had read the Bible and admired its precepts, but added, his principal objections are that Christians do not follow them. Another well-known Muslim slave lived not far from here. In fact, he was the first Muslim enslaved in North America whose individual story is known. In the earliest accounts, he is called Job ben Solomon, and the story of his enslavement is a reminder that in history, we should always be suspect of looking for clear victims and villains. When he was captured on the west coast of Africa in 1730, he had actually been in the process of selling 2 other men into bondage. He was betrayed by a slave merchant while negotiating a price and then transported to America in chains. He was sold at the harbor in Annapolis and then put to work on Kent Island. Like Omar ibn Said, he tried to escape, and when he was recaptured, he was put into a jail in Annapolis, and a judge visited him and interviewed him extensively. This judge published a book about Job ben Solomon's life in 1734, and in this book he expresses astonishment to discover that the enslaved men and women among them had come from a civilization all their own, had fully developed religious worldviews all their own. A clue to what happened to these forgotten Muslims and the beliefs they brought with them can be found in the words of a missionary who traveled through the South to preach on plantations in the 1830s and into the 40s. Many Mohammedan Africans, he noted in 1841, had found ways to, quote, accommodate Islam to the new beliefs imposed upon them. This is a quote from him again. God, say they, is Allah, and Jesus Christ is Muhammad. The religion is the same, they say, but different countries have different names. The missionary who recorded these words considered this to be evidence of Muslims' inability to recognize the importance of religious truths. But in fact, it proves just the opposite. They understood that their faith was important enough that they should listen for it everywhere, even in a country so distant from the places where they had once heard the calls to prayer, even in a nation where only non-Muslims like Thomas Jefferson were able to own a copy of the Quran. What it meant to be a Muslim in America at the time was likely beyond Jefferson's interest or comprehension. But nonetheless, the sacred text, the text sacred to all those uncounted thousands of enslaved followers of Islam, that was there among his books, moving with all those others from Virginia to Washington. To me, it seems both the tragedy and the opportunity of history to recognize that it's only from a distance of centuries that we can see the true significance of that one book among the nearly 7,000. Only now can we know that book's movement meant that the same words written by a fugitive slave in coal dust on a jail cell wall were even then being moved into the Library of Congress. Already a part of the American experience, they then became a kind of time capsule, waiting for a faith nearly eradicated in the United States to return. A similar set of connections might be drawn from another book trucked up from Monticello to Washington 200 years ago this month. That was a book called A New Pantheon, which is a history of the heathen gods. It was, for the most part, a book about Greek and Roman mythology, but if you look closely at it, you realize that it also concerned itself with the influence of Indian religious ideas on the classical world. Now, did Jefferson have any idea that those heathen gods, even then, were changing the shape of his own country? Probably not. But as his books moved north, some Americans were beginning to come to that understanding. Well, Massachusetts, my home state, gave us book burners like Cyrus King. At the same time, there lived outside of Boston a woman roughly the same age as King, and actually roughly the same age as Omar ibn Said. Just a nice accident of history, both Omar ibn Said, Cyrus King, and this woman whose life I'm about to describe, they were all born within 2 years of the revolution. Their lives map perfectly with the first near century of American life. but they all had vastly different American experiences. This woman's name was Mary Moody Emerson. She could trace her family deep into Puritan New England and even claimed she was carried as an infant across the conquered battlefield. By 1815, she was in her late 30s and unmarried by choice. By all accounts, she valued her independence above all else, and she did not suffer fools. As one admirer noted, her blue eyes flashed like steel and stabbed like swords. She was expert in the look that demolishes. In her later years, she was known to wear a long black veil just walking around town, as if she didn't trust her family to properly put her into a burial shroud. When her death finally did come in 1863, again, the very year Omar ibn Said died, a Boston newspaper remarked, "Mary Moody Emerson was thought to have the power of saying more disagreeable things in half an hour than any person living." She was, in other words, a prototypical American eccentric, and she was also, at least according to her contemporaries, an undeniable genius. In her youth, she had been formed by the kinds of books found in Jefferson's library, works ranging from the poet of the Enlightenment, John Milton, to the preacher of the Great Awakening, Jonathan Edwards, and from the classical philosophy of Plato to the classical liberalism of John Locke, and of course, her Bible. All these influences made Mary Moody Emerson particularly receptive to an unlikely meeting she had a few years later while she was making a religious retreat at a nearby parsonage. It was there that she met a mysterious figure whom she refers to in her diary only as, quote, "our stranger." He was a man who had recently arrived from India and who was invited to give a discourse on heathen gods, just like the book in Jefferson's library, and on how those heathen gods might inform us about the relationship of Hindu ideas to Christianity. Such discourses at the time, by the way, were much less uncommon than you might think. One of the real gems I discovered during my endless searching through the historical newspaper database was that George Washington himself had once attended a poetry reading dedicated to the Hindu god of love. He attended this reading, and it was with a wonderful write-up, in May of 1787, the very month when he was elected president of the Constitutional Convention. He was passing the time learning about the Hindu god of love. And the write-up, other than Washington's presence at this event, does not give many other details other than that the poems themselves were recited, and this is what the account said, by a lady. Unnamed. Well, during the course of the talk on Hinduism heard by Mary Emerson, our stranger presented his audience with images of the Hindu god Vishnu in various forms. He showed his audience Vishnu with a whale's tail, Vishnu with bared teeth like a tiger, Vishnu with the shell of a tortoise, Vishnu with the tusks of a boar. In other images, Vishnu was presented as the avatar of Krishna and presented again as Buddha. Something in these images, according to Mary Emerson's diary, apparently touched her very deeply. She was very pious in her Christian faith, and her faith was not shaken by what she saw. On the contrary, she discovered in this diversity of belief a complement to her own. She recognized in these Hindu images elements of classical mythology that had been part of her well-rounded education. But more than this, these stories of Vishnu she encountered for the first time presented aspects of God she counted among her own beliefs. Given her prickly temperament, she was not close to many people, but she did have one nephew, then newly graduated from Harvard, whom she had taken under her wing as a confidant and protege. Following our stranger's lecture on Hindu mythology, she excitedly sat down and wrote him a letter. "My dear Waldo," she wrote to her nephew, "I have been fortunate this week to find a visitor here from India, well versed in its literature and theology. He showed us some fine representations of the incarnation of Vishnu. At bottom of the histories of these incarnations is the doctrine of the universal presence and agency of the one God." Our stranger had made a gift of these images of Vishnu to Mary Emerson, and she in turn sent them to her nephew. It was a single small gesture, but it turned out to be one that played a part in the transformation of American literature. Mary's nephew was Ralph Waldo Emerson. He was founder of the Transcendentalist movement in American poetry, and among the earliest men of letters in the United States to take an interest in the region of the world broadly then called the East. Genius though many of her contemporaries may have called Mary Emerson, we likely know her name now only because of her connection to this great man in the making. In this she joins uncountable talented women who were not allowed either by family or social constraints to meet their full potential. Yet in Mary's case, we might find some solace in the possibility that we know Ralph Waldo's name only because of the inspiration she offered him. As he later said of his aunt, "If Aunt Mary finds out anything is dear or sacred to you, she instantly flings broken crockery at it." She was, in other words, the stone against which he sharpened the edge of his mind. We often discuss religion in terms of communities and denominations, but ideas also move from person to person. A letter from an aunt to her nephew results years later in Ralph Waldo Emerson lending his newly acquired copy of the Bhagavad Gita to Henry David Thoreau, who takes it with him to a little cabin in the woods near a pond where he writes, quote, "The pure Walden water is mingled with the sacred water of the Ganges." Even a writer like Herman Melville, who at times was scathingly critical of Emerson and Thoreau, he drank from these same waters. Aunt Mary wrote to Waldo of the Hindu god Vishnu, and sure enough, Vishnu later turns up with a starring role in Moby Dick. The chase at the heart of that great American novel is not merely after an image of God or death, but what Melville alludes to at least a dozen times as, quote, "the Hindu whale, an incarnation of Vishnu." Now, that may seem like a shaky connection until you read in Melville's diary at the time an account of hearing a lecture given by Emerson during the very time Melville was writing Moby Dick. He says that he considers Emerson, after hearing him speak, a man who dives deep to find meaning. This is Melville's quote, "Any fish can swim near the surface, but it takes a great whale to go down 5 miles or more." In this, he connected Emerson directly not only to the whale he was then himself writing obsessively about, but to Vishnu, whom he describes in the very same terms in a story recounted in Moby Dick, in which the Hindu deity dives to the depths to find the Vedas, the holiest books in Hinduism, and deliver them to the world. What we see here is a sharing of religious ideas within just a single family that eventually changes American literature and prepares the ground for the arrival of Hindu practices decades later when actual Hindus begin to arrive in this country. Like Jefferson's Quran, the heathen gods that traveled north from Monticello to Washington may have been far removed from the lives for whom many gods were a religious reality and not just a literary trope. But through such reading, Jefferson had at least become open to the idea. In fact, he makes a point of citing a multiplicity of gods in his most famous defense of religious pluralism. As he wrote in his only published book in his lifetime, which in fact was not included in that wagon train bringing his books up to Washington, Notes on the State of Virginia. As he wrote then, "It does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg." He didn't stop there. He continues to make the case that difference of opinion is advantageous in religion. Is uniformity even attainable, he asked? Let us reflect that the world is inhabited by 1,000 millions of people, that these profess probably 1,000 different systems of religion, that ours is but one of that 1,000. Not only is this an argument that the majority religious tradition might have something to learn from those on the margins of dominant faith, it's an argument that, when seen globally, all faith is marginal. Each on its own is but one in 1,000, yet joined together in a community of faiths and of belief and non-belief, each can somehow become part of something bigger, ennobled through moments of interaction and transformation. This, to me, is the real meaning and significance of all those books coming down from one hilltop in Virginia and heading for another in Washington. The spiritual diversity within them represented only the beginning of the multi-religious nation this country would become. And it's also a reminder to think more critically about the religious labels we use. After all, the church-going owner of that infidel library was himself a Christian, as was the Hindu-influenced daughter of Puritans, Mary Moody Emerson, and so was, by the end of his life, the enslaved Muslim teacher Omar ibn Said. That three such different American experiences could fit in the same religious box should be enough that we might never hear the phrase Christian nation the same way again. And this isn't just a matter of history. Congress today is only slightly less religiously uniform than the Congress that debated the possibility of burning Jefferson's library 200 years ago this month. A recent study found that 92% of members of the 114th Congress belong to churches of one kind or another. Yet many of our current lawmakers, like the nation they represent, may be more spiritually diverse than any mere accounting can describe. For example, among the hundreds of members of Congress sworn into office with their hands on the Bible in recent years, there was a Buddhist, Georgia Representative Hank Johnson, who used the Christian text, he said, as a nod to tradition rather than a statement of belief. When the then mayor of Newark, Cory Booker, who's now a senator, when he announced his interest in pursuing higher office in 2012, this Baptist from New Jersey did so beside a stack of books that he keeps to this day on his office desk that would have been right at home at Monticello. These books included a New Testament, a Hebrew Bible, and a Bhagavad Gita. And in 2007, the first Muslim member of Congress, Representative Keith Ellison of Minnesota, he took his oath of office using the same copy of the Quran that was trucked from Charlottesville to Washington 192 years before. That event was perhaps the inevitable end of a journey that I like to think represents the true place of belief in all its diversity in American life. I think of it like this: thousands of ideas moving together across 100 miles of difficult terrain. I imagine them bumping and jostling in constant conflict and contradiction with each other. But somehow, they're all moving on the same road. Thank you. I would love if there were any questions at all, and I would be happy to answer them. Yes?
I just want to comment a little bit. That the whole hippie experience, that culture, it looks like they had to take a dipping board and go into antiquity because they brought from early Christianity, Eastern mysticism, Native American. So you end up with a photo of people in grades standing by a wigwam with a neat-other man with a Danny Nicholson hat. The other thing, I think you might like this. I was in one of these shops for hippie paraphernalia on the West Coast, and they had all these posters, and they were all revolutionaries. And then here's one of Christ. It's not like Christ you've ever seen. It's not Wasp, it's not Wine, it's not McClellan. Very Semitic, Jericho. Hands are huge. He's a carpenter. And he's got a beam on his back, and he's turning like he recognizes you. It's like, literally somebody got it right. I also like the very end of the movie very much. It's different because the harpooner tells the ship's carpenter, pretends that we're all going to be killed. He has him cut designs into his coffin, and then as that vortex takes the ship down, that coffin just comes up like a surfboard,
Right.
And saves his best friend. It's the resurrection of transit.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. This sounds like a flip comment, but yeah, Moby Dick is a good book. And I was actually reminded that this is another way that being at Washington College made this book possible for me. I had read Moby Dick, in high school, I guess, but I hadn't really immersed myself in it until I was writing about it here. And I actually, when I was driving very often back and forth between Annapolis and Chestertown, I got the audiobook of Moby Dick. And so coming back and forth over the bridge and back over the bridge, I was immersed in Moby Dick, and I was just thinking about all those things. And there's so many themes, and it's in some ways the perfect book for thinking about religion, belief in America, and the diversity of religion in America for all the reasons you just said. But the start of your comment about the hippie moment, it's really a fascinating thing that I think that even as it was happening, and it was slightly before my time, it seemed it was thought of as this new thing that the kids were doing. But there are moments like that throughout American history, these revivals that take different forms by gathering moments from the past and mixing them together in new ways. You know, most of mainstream Protestant Christianity today grows out of this moment called the Great Awakening, the First and Second Great Awakenings. And in some ways, they were the hippie movements of their day. I mean, the very idea that you wouldn't necessarily need to go worship in church. You could go out in the field and you're going to hear the preacher with his collapsible pulpit. He's just going to preach for 3 hours without stopping. You know, I think it was trippy to a lot of people that you could actually do that. And so the idea that this moment that is enshrined in conservative American religious history would have any resonance with its antithesis, I think would be really surprising and enlightening to many. But if you take the long view of American history, I think that those types of resonances will begin to emerge. Thank you. Yes?
I was wondering, when England went to the island of Australia and got slaves there, was there in research any of the influence of the Dreamtime song, a culture that some scholars say is 100,000 years old, it's the oldest culture ever. I was curious, those slaves that came from Australia, if they had any effect, Dreamtime song, the women that paint, they actually painted rocks, symbols on these rocks, using their own hair. That's extraordinary culture. Did it affect the United States? Did any slaves came?
I honestly have not read or seen any specific evidence pointing towards Australian Aboriginal influence, but I will say that what is discussed very broadly as slave religion are great syncretisms of beliefs drawn together from many different cultures. Not only African cultures, I would not be surprised if Australian Aboriginal cultures were involved, but Native American cultures. There's an idea or a religious theme throughout American history that I write about in the book, is the tradition called hoodoo. And hoodoo is one of these traditions that's sometimes confused with voodoo, and voodoo is the more technical scholarly word. But hoodoo is a more of a practical magic religious tradition drawing on African traditions blended with Native American traditions that arises in the American South on plantations and can be seen even after the end of slavery. And one of the most remarkable documents I came across was, I believe he was a Presbyterian minister who was an amateur ethnographer, and he traveled in, I believe it was Ohio, someplace you wouldn't expect, and made these great catalogs of African American magical practices that can be traced back centuries. And within the book, the connection I make, looking through the centuries and looking for the types of connections, you can find the same type of magic, as they called it, or witchcraft that was practiced in Salem during the Salem witch trials, you can find much later in early 20th century African American magical practices. In the book, I retell the story of the Salem witch trials and of the woman Tituba, who was probably a South American Indian, but brought her own magical and religious practices with her to Massachusetts. And the only act of magic or witchcraft that takes place in Salem that kicks off this entire hysteria that leads to the hanging of witches is the baking of something called a witch cake, which, if you remember the story of Salem witch trials very briefly, a number of girls come down with some kind of mysterious malady, and this enslaved woman decides she's going to find out what is wrong with one of the girls, and so she makes this thing called a witch cake, which you take some rye flour, you take some other ingredients, you mix it together with the urine of a dog, and you bake it, and then you feed it to the dog. It's a strange thing. But that is the thing, that is the one moment, if you look at the history of what actually happened in Salem, that's the one moment that anyone would say this is witchcraft. And that same practice, that same idea of the witch cake can be found really up until the middle of the 20th century in certain pockets of American life, at least according to this one ethnographer who charted it. And so It's a roundabout answer to your question, but the answer is that though the assumption made by those who were imposing Christianity on people like Omar ibn Said was that their religious lives could be easily transformed and replaced by the dominant faith. Though that assumption eventually led to widespread conversion to Christianity, all those beliefs and practices were much more resilient than is usually remembered, existing for centuries in ways not noticed by the missionaries who would come to spread their own version of the faith. Thank you. Any other thoughts or questions? Yes.
Hi, Peter. Congratulations on the book.
Thank you. Thank you.
There's been a lot that's been written about deists like Thomas Jefferson who were very unconventional in their religious beliefs. But I was wondering in your research, did you uncover much about maybe more pronounced atheists or agnostics? And do you talk about that in the book at all?
Yeah.
Aside from maybe what Thomas Paine is a good example, the one that everyone hears about, but did you cover much evidence of that?
Yeah, see. Currently, I will preface this comment by saying currently, with my family, I go to a Presbyterian church. And the atheist I write about in the book is a Presbyterian. This is a fellow named William Livingston. He was the first governor of New Jersey. And he was before he was a patriot and a revolutionary and a politician, he was very much a rabble-rouser. And in one of the early fights against establishment was the one that he led in New York State against, the details are escaping me now, but against the establishing King's College, or Columbia College was King's College, establishing that college as Anglican. And he led this scathing battle in the press against that establishment. And the reason I write about him in my atheist chapter is because he is the first person I can find who did not mind being called an atheist. He wrote about the establishment in such a way that invited it. Before he came along, and I think this is in the 1750s, before he came along, atheism was really just an insult that you would use to question someone's morals. And it was something that you didn't want to be called an atheist in public. But then this fellow and a few of his cohort begin writing in such a way that they are inviting people to call them atheists, and they are not saying no. And so, while he would probably not have claimed that he was an atheist, in the way that people would say they are atheists today, it was a shift in the understanding of what being an atheist means. It was a connection with the idea that that religious authority and the authority of the crown were connected. And if you're going to stand against one, you need to stand against the other. This is very different from the way we think of atheism today, obviously. And one of the points I try to make in the book is that atheism is far more contextual and situational than we usually think of today. It's often just to stand against whatever authority there is. And the anecdote I like that illustrates that is that in the second century, the group that was most often being called atheists were Christians, because they did not recognize the many gods. They said there was only one God. And so to the Romans, the Christians were the atheists. And so who is an atheist often depends on what you think the meaning of God is. So I get into that a little bit in the book, but I've not been particularly interested in 20th century political atheism with Medal and Murray O'Hair and that sort of narrative. I feel like that's been talked about a lot, but I wanted to identify some pre-revolutionary atheism, and I found a little bit of it. But a lot of it is, much like the treatment of Hindu ideas, a lot of it is as a literary trope. It's using the ideas, using the terms, without necessarily saying, I am a proud atheist. Yes?
Mary Moody Emerson related to the white Moody, the evangelist?
Yes, I believe so, but I could not draw the family tree, but I believe so. There's actually a well-known novelist named Rick Moody who recently discovered that he was related to the whole Moody clan, and he wrote a book about it called The Long Black Veil, about his eccentric great aunt who was known for wearing this burial shroud around Concord. Yes?
Wonderful presentation. I wonder if you could say something about the potential influence of some of the Native American spirituality on the founding fathers. And I'm thinking especially of the Hope Masonic. If I'm not mistaken, before the Constitution was finally drafted, there were all chiefs who were invited to come and speak to our founding fathers about their understanding of democracy and the court, and to the kind of spirituality. My understanding is that a lot of the strands of participatory democracy were really some actualized in the home. Predictions of shape the Constitution. And so different kind of Constitution.
Yeah. The question, if you didn't hear it, was the influence of the Iroquois on the founding fathers, and this is a real controversial issue among some historians. There are some who put forward this idea called the Iroquois influence theory, which makes the case that the Iroquois Confederacy is a much older democracy than the United States, and it was here for centuries, and that the framers of the Constitution knew something of the way they govern themselves and borrowed from it. That idea has been popularized by two historians particularly, and many other historians have sort of ganged up against them to say, no, that's not the case. It's a nice idea, but it's fantasy, at least according to these historians. But the way in which I try to approach it is, without weighing in on either side of that controversy, is trying to identify the ways in which Native American religious ideas were more broadly influential. I think that one thing that we often forget is that Europeans and Native Americans were having this inter-influence on the North American continent for longer than the United States has existed as a republic. That's a long time, and this interaction was not merely a matter of dominant Christianity coming in and converting all of Native America, though that is certainly part of it, and that certainly happened. I think the majority of Native Americans now are Christians, and it's really only a much smaller number who've managed or reclaimed traditional beliefs. But what is more interesting to me is this inter-influence, is the way in which Europeans, when they arrived here, they encountered a people who raised for them a very serious theological question, which was, how do you account for a civilization that your divinely given account of creation does not account for, that your understanding of God does not make space for? How do you explain these people? And so from the earliest moments of European interaction with Native America, you find the more forward thinking among them trying to make sense of this. In New England, when Roger Williams was evicted from Massachusetts, he spent a lot of time lost among the Narragansett in Rhode Island, and he spent much of his time making these great catalogs of their beliefs, enumerating their gods. I think he counted 37 gods among the Narragansett, and this was not just novelty to him. This was meaningful, and I think it's no accident that it is then in Rhode Island that you have the really first occurrence of the idea of religious freedom. I mean, not only because he was exiled from one religious colony and started another, but he had been exposed to the great variety of religion all around him. But really, I think the most surprising way in which Native America seems to have influenced the religious tradition that was brought here, the religious traditions that were brought here, came again through the Iroquois, but particularly through the prophet Handsome Lake. Handsome Lake, who was greatly admired by Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, during his presidency, wrote him a letter and called him brother and praised him for this religious movement that he was starting. Handsome Lake was in his life, until the end of his life, he was sort of a ne'er-do-well. He was known for drinking too much and causing trouble, but then he had a religious experience, and he began a new religion, basically, which was a blending of the Quakerism that was being taught by missionaries with his own understanding of Native American traditions. And his own movement was small but influential, but the way it ended up being even more influential is that a number of Mormon scholars lately have been wondering if Handsome Lake actually influenced Joseph Smith. That Joseph Smith had a vision where he found his plates buried in the ground in which the Book of Mormon was written. He had a vision of a number of prophets visiting him and explaining where to find what he would find. And if you look at what Handsome Lake was describing as his vision early in the 1800s, and then you look at Joseph Smith's vision a couple decades later, you find incredible resonances. And when you look at Joseph Smith, you see that he was someone who was obsessed with Native America in a way that reflects that original question of what do you do with this people not explained by my understanding of creation. And what Joseph Smith did, either by invention or by revelation, was he brought forth this entire scripture that wrote Native America into the biblical story. And this was subversive enough that Mormons, of course, were driven from the United States, but then in turn played a role in opening up the entire West for the United States to expand into. So within the book, I'm really fascinated by the way a fellow like Handsome Lake, who is largely forgotten by American history, can have a really outsized influence if you look for it. And it's not a direct, because Handsome Lake, the Mormons opened Utah. It doesn't work that way. But religious influence has this way of slowly carving its way, like water through rock. And so the question of Native American influence, I think, is much more significant than merely being a matter of what we think of as Native American spirituality today. Thanks for the question. Any other thoughts? Yes?
Did Saeed continue practicing Islam for the rest of his life? Did he end up converting to Christianity?
That's a good question. The question was, did Omar ibn Said convert to Christianity, or did he continue to practice Islam? The answer may be yes, both. And he, it's fascinating the way in which someone like Omar ibn Said was remembered and was used as a symbol even in his lifetime. One of the most widely publicized stories of Omar ibn Said was published in 1837. It was published in a number of places all around the country. And it came immediately in the time frame of the early American press. It came 2 years after an event that really shook a lot of people in the United States, which was a Muslim-led slave revolt in Brazil. This was in the city of Bahia, and it was really one of the bloodiest slave revolts that had occurred in the Americas, and it was led specifically by Muslim religious leaders. And when word of this spread through the United States, it really was terrifying both to slaveholders and even those outside the slave states, because it presented the possibility of holy wars breaking out on plantations, of religiously led slave revolts. And so when this story of Omar ibn Said is published in 1837, it has a headline, a convert from Islam, and then it goes on to recount all of his great Christian virtues. But then when it actually gets down and quotes him, the words they put in his mouth are so unbelievable that you have to wonder what the true content of his faith was. They actually quote Omar ibn Said in this 1837 article saying, "God bless the American land. God bless the white people." This is a man who was kidnapped when he was 37 years old, torn from his family and transported across the ocean. I just have a hard time believing that he says, if not under duress, God bless the American land, God bless the white people. And so certainly in how he was presented at the end of his life, he was presented as being a God-fearing, a Christian God-fearing, a church-going man. But one of the documents that is attributed to him for many years was described as Omar ibn Said's handwritten Arabic Lord's Prayer. So the prayer of Christianity he had translated into Arabic, and this was popularized. But only very recently has someone actually looked at it and said, this isn't the Lord's Prayer. And it's actually another Quranic verse that he wrote down. But because it was in Arabic, no one knew what they were looking at. And so he may have been subversive in that way himself, that when asked to write the Lord's Prayer, he wrote a prayer that he knew. And the prayer that he knew and that he felt most deeply was still the prayer that he had known when he was able to call himself a Muslim. Yes?
Was he then freed at some point? It sounds like he was.
Oh, he was not freed.
No, he was enslaved the whole time, all of this.
As I said, he died in 1863, and so he was not freed. The other individual I mentioned, Abdul Rahman Ibrahim, he was freed. And he was freed mainly because he became this great cause celeb, and it was decided that he would be a good political middleman between Africa and America. And so he was freed actually with the help of some highly placed political figures at the time. And one of the reasons he was taken around on a tour was to raise money for his passage back to I believe it was Angola where he was from. So he was freed, but for the most part, they were not. And I should say also that these one or two individual Muslims whose stories we know their stories because in some ways they were given special treatment, and in one case they were freed. But by far the majority, we will never know their stories, and they lived and died in slavery. Yes. Any other thoughts or questions? We should wrap things up. Thank you all for listening. I really do appreciate it. Thank you.
I'm reminded that I neglected to mention that there's a little reception back here for Peter. So some of you, I'm sure, especially who know Peter from his Chestertown days, or those who would just like to meet him tonight, are welcome to hang out and join us before you go back into the weather.